I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare Anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode.
Hi, Kourtney.
Hi, Elyse. How's it going?
It's going okay. I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold, so.
Yeah, it is cold season.
But I'm very much on the tail end, just kind of sniffling a little still. How are you?
Which is the perfect thing for a podcast where
perfect for recording.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm doing well. I'm going to be starting the dissertation phase of my master's degree, so I'm really excited to be heading into that. And then I'm also really excited that we are diving into Henry V.
Yes.
And our actual topics about this play. It was really great to do the synopsis and the stuff to chew on, but like this is the core of what we do on the podcast is take these topics, dive deeper, and see what you can make of them as scholars, as readers, as theater practitioners. And so, like, I'm very excited to really be diving into Henry V, or Henry V, however you want to say the title of the play.
Yeah, I'm also very excited. It's nice to be getting back. You know, twice a year we take some like behind the scenes hiatuses where we do a lot of work to get everything recorded so we can have like a month of not researching, writing, recording, researching, writing, recording. But it is nice to get like back into that cycle. It's like, oh, right, This is what I do. This is what I like love to do. So
yes.
And we've got a lot going on for 2025.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, we want to start off 2025 by shouting out our Patreon patrons who have been supporting us through 2024. So thank you so much to Clocky M,
Nat Y,
Devin S,
Katie S,
Kiara,
Shelby G,
Alan C,
Elizabeth S,
Gwen,
Kathleen O,
Claire S,
Liz S,
Megan M,
Lisa V,
Ashton F,
Ann C,
Sujatha N,
David W,
Sue,
Kim,
and our newest Patreon patron, Kelly.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for supporting us in 2024.
Yes, we are a podcast that is completely listener funded. And so all of your contributions through Patreon has helped us to grow the podcast. And we have a lot of really exciting things happening in 2025 that we want to share with our listeners.
Yeah, Patreon is our home for behind the scenes and bonus content. So if you want to connect with our incredible community over there and support the pod and get a little behind the scenes extra content, you can join us at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
Mm-hmm.
For this month, we are actually going to be making and tasting an Elizabethan era cocktail. And I'm putting cocktail in like air quotes.
Yeah.
It's called a spiced milk aphrodisiac, which are 3 words that I don't think anyone wants next to each other, but we're going to try it. We're going to make it and try it.
Yeah, we are going to put ourselves and our bodies on the line to see what the early modern cocktails were all about.
Yes. So if you want more information on that, join us over on Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
We also, this year, are officially launching our email list. We've had on our website a place to join our email list, and we are actually going to be starting to send out monthly emails that will recap everything that's kind of going on in the world of Shakespeare Anyone. So all of our episodes that we've released, looks back at what we've done in previous years, as well as a look at what's happening in Patreon. So it's a nice roundup of everything Shakespeare Anyone.
So go join the email list if you want to stay informed on Shakespeare Anyone every month.
There'll be a link in the episode notes. And you can also find it on our website at shakespeareanyone.com.
Mm-hmm.
And last but not least, hey teachers. If you're a teacher, if you teach English language arts or drama, especially for upper grades, so for the United States, we're looking for teachers who teach grades 9 through 12. If you're outside the United States, students from the ages of 14 to 18. We've heard such great feedback from educators who use our podcast in their classrooms, and we want to know more from you about obstacles you face when teaching Shakespeare in the classroom. So we have a survey for teachers at our website, www.shakespeareanyone.com/teacher survey. And your answers to the survey will help us develop future resources to support teachers. The link is also in our episode notes.
Yes. And if you are a teacher and have a cohort of teachers, or aren't a teacher and know teachers, and you know that they teach Shakespeare or want to teach Shakespeare, please send the resource to anyone who is a teacher so that we can get as much information so that Shakespeare Anyone can help provide resources, because we know that being an educator is a very big task. And so we want to help make it fun, exciting, and accessible teaching Shakespeare.
Yeah. Okay. That is
a little bit of housekeeping.
A lot of housekeeping, but I think now we're ready to dive into our episode. Today we're going to be talking about the historical figures in Henry V. Our summary episode really talks about how these figures are represented by Shakespeare, and today we're going to be looking more at the historical fact. I'm calling this we've been calling this historical fact versus Shakespeare's fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be going into the biographies of these characters in this play for their actual historical counterparts.
Yes. And also, this is a broad overview of these historical figures. This is a big cast of figures in the play itself. And so we are going to be discussing the tip of the iceberg for many of these characters.
Yes.
I think aside from Henry and other very major characters, but there are some characters who are featured and we're going to talk about them, but we are not going to go into their whole story because we want to explore these characters as they are related to Shakespeare's play.
Yes. So these are going to be some headlines. We also only have a little over an hour to get through a large cast of historical figures. So some of them will be more bullet points and headlines and how they are interrelated and what their relationships are that the play doesn't quite get into, but how these historical figures were interlinked.
Right. And I want to start this episode by acknowledging that this play is a historical reconstruction, and the play is also very direct to its audience about the fact that this is a historical reconstruction. And this is evident in the chorus, and it's also evident in some of the bits of dialogue from, say, Henry. Henry says, quote, "This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the end of the world, but we in it shall be remembered," unquote. So the play is very open about the fact that this is reconstructing something that happened, but we're looking at how accurately.
Yes.
And Shakespeare's play, before we dive into the historical figures, Shakespeare used Holinshed's chronicles, but this story really is retold in both the chronicles of Hall's as well as Holinshed's, and this is classified or categorized as the tale of the Tudor myth, quote unquote Tudor myth, an English history myth for Henry V's purposes that goes from the deposition of Richard II to the historic rise of the Lancastrian Henry V to the War of the Roses under Henry VI to the defeat of Richard III by the first Tudor king, Henry VII, who is Elizabeth I's grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes this play is seen as being staged as a piece of patriotic pageantry. However, scholars acknowledge that the uncut text undercuts this patriotism that is oftentimes staged. And that's due to the fact that Shakespeare includes these common soldiers and the Eastcheap Company, and they make commentary about this kind of pageantry and patriotism of this English campaign for Henry. And Henry himself also questions this patriotism. So Shakespeare's using this Tudor myth from Holinshed's Chronicles and Hall's as well, but then he's also adding this commentary, which may or not have been a part of the popular imagination of the people of that time. As you said, Elyse, in our Stuff to Chew On, there was the Essex campaign and return. So
yes,
yeah,
it's very much Henry V, the story of Henry V through an Elizabethan Tudor lens.
exactly. But Shakespeare wasn't the first to write a play about Henry V's battle at Agincourt. Renaissance writers of the time understood that history is a tool for nation building. And so oftentimes writers had ideological purposes when they were retelling history. And we see that today. It's just a part of retelling history with a sort of, I don't want to say propaganda, but like a lens. It's having a certain lens, a story that you want to tell. And so Shakespeare's history plays and these plays in the Elizabethan theater are no exception. So there is this idea of taking these plays from the history books, from Holinshed, from halls, and then putting them on the stage as a celebration of this English history. Shakespeare used Holinshed's Chronicles as a source for Henry V or Henry V. And there are a lot of parts of the Chronicles that have made it into Shakespeare's play. One of them is the fact that Henry reigned for 9 years. The events of the play are 4 of his 9 years. So this play is like a slice of those 4 years. And you mentioned, Elyse, in the Stuff to Chew On that like there's a kind of condensing, but the years are 1414, 1415, 1416, and 1420. So Henry V covers 38 pages in the Chronicles, and 17 of these pages might have been used by Shakespeare. And there are some key details or key events in the Chronicle that the play includes. And that is, number 1, the Dauphin's gift of tennis balls. 2, Henry's Council of War, which includes Canterbury's speech, which Shakespeare might have taken. 3, the conspirators' plot of Cambridge, Scroop, and Grey. 4, the siege and victor of Harfleur. 5, the Battle of Agincourt. 6, the wooing of Princess Catherine. And 7, the singing of the Treaty of Troy. And there are some events that Shakespeare does not include, and that is the persecution of Lord Cobham and the Lollards, because there was a proto-Protestant leader that,
I'll get into some Lollards too.
Perfect. Yeah. The figure of Oldcastle, who is involved with the Lollards that is cut, is possibly inspiration for Falstaff. He doesn't go by Oldcastle in Henry V. He was Oldcastle in Henry IV, Part 1, I believe, but descendants of Oldcastle got upset, and so he was changed to Falstaff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second event that is not included is the second campaign of Henry in France before the peace treaty was signed.
Yep.
There is a play that Shakespeare likely used as a source, and that play is The Famous Victories of Henry V, which is by Anonymous. And the reason why scholars think that Shakespeare took more from this play than Holinshed's Chronicles is because this play, The Famous Victories, includes 6 of the 7 events. Shakespeare added the conspirators, but the layout of Shakespeare's drama, the content and the comedy, are all in The Famous Victories. And Henry V was written about 2 decades after this play by an anonymous playwright first premiered in the 1580s. So, yes, Shakespeare used Holinshed's Chronicles, we know this, but he more likely took more from this play that had already existed. So he might also be like fan fictioning from another play that had already been staged and published and performed by the Queen's Men.
Okay.
So that's just a little bit of background about like there's the history and then there's the Chronicles and then there's Shakespeare's play. So I just wanted to like preface that like within all of this fan fiction, the fan fiction came from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Shakespeare wasn't just making it up on his own. So now we'll get into some real facts about these people, about the real people.
Yes.
So starting off with our King Henry V, the biggest difference between historical Henry and Shakespeare's Henry is that essentially, and we are in Henry V, we hear it talked about a little bit of what he was like when he was younger, as Prince Hal, and how he has, turned a complete 180 from the days of
drinking and
being a
debauchery.
rake. Yeah. Drinking and debauchery. The biggest difference between historical Henry and Shakespeare's Henry is that Prince Hal probably did not exist. Shakespeare's Prince Hal was probably not actually part of Henry's character. From the time he was about like 13, 14, he was being prepared to be the king once Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV. And in fact, historical Henry V was, according to Dan Jones in his book Henry V, The Astonishing Triumph of England's Greatest Warrior King, historical Henry was probably the most prepared heir to the throne since Edward I. Basically, he had this really intense king internship during his time as Prince of Wales, especially as Henry IV dealt with bouts of sickness. Not only was Prince Henry leading Wales as the leader of Wales, but he also had to step in for his father. He was seen as tough, ambitious, seen as having a lack of sentimentality. One thing that is true is that he was at odds with his father, but it was mostly due to his ambition, in that Henry IV, when he was well, he did not like the feeling of there being two kings in the country.
I imagine most kings don't.
Yeah. There is one contemporary account of the Prince Hal figure, but it's at odds with the vast majority of other depictions of him. The vast majority of accounts of what Prince Henry is like is that he is serious, he takes his job very seriously, and that he was a effective and tough, ambitious guy, and very much ready to be king.
Mm-hmm.
The only time where it is actually possible that he behaved like Hal is in his mid-20s, which is another period of time when his father's health was diminishing and he was just basically sitting and waiting to become king. There are other accounts that come later and maybe partially or wholly true based on gossip, but they just don't really truly align with the huge amount of evidence of responsible Hal, that Prince Hal, the rapscallion, the guy that we see in Henry IV parts 1 and 2, likely didn't actually exist. Some things that did happen, though, that we do have records of, is there's a scene in Henry IV part 2 where Henry IV seems dead and Hal takes the crown and it then leaves, and Henry IV then wakes up and is like, what happened to the crown? He took it, and then lectures Henry, and Prince Henry's like, I thought you were dead. I thought I'd never see you again. I'm so loyal to you. That we do have records that did happen.
Oh.
And then there's also records that indicate that the tennis ball incident happened. Not quite as Shakespeare staged it. The Dauphin was at that point 17, about 10 years younger than Henry, and very sassy, and sent them to Henry so that Henry could, quote, play with his young men, as is his wont, unquote. And Henry apparently, again, this is Henry V, King Henry V, quipped back, he'd send back London balls, aka cannonballs. Another account of this tennis ball incident is that it possibly didn't actually happen. He wasn't actually shipped tennis balls, but that there was this rumor that the French were gossiping about Henry V at court and saying that they should do this, and then he quipped that back.
Gotcha. So it's more a hypothetically, if you did this with the tennis balls, I would send over cannonballs.
Yeah. There's records that he did receive tennis balls. There's also records that he didn't actually receive them, but he just heard rumors and that this joke was going around.
Gotcha.
As you mentioned, he persecuted Lollards, which were proto-Protestants, and he was a very pious Catholic. One of his major goals as king was unification and kind of restoring harmony in the country after the civil wars of his father. And so he was a very, very pious Catholic. Although he persecuted Lollards and these proto-Protestants were burned at the stake or hung, he also sometimes just sent them away to be imprisoned in the Tower for the rest of their lives to just keep the peace. Of course, again, as we're talking about the lens of Tudor England, of Elizabethan England, is a very Protestant lens. So that part's going to get cut.
Yeah.
He was also seen as generous because he allowed Englishmen to purchase amnesty or pardons for crimes instead of being brought before the law and having to go through the whole legal process. They could essentially pay a fine and no harm, no foul.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also seen as generous because he decided to pay the bereaved family members of those who died at Agincourt the full amount of their dead family members' contract. There was a brief debate over should they get paid the fractional amount of the contract that like the family member served like until the day they died, or should they pay the full amount? And he was just like, just pay them the full amount. Like, that's so much math.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also I'm assuming too that the people who went and served were also like in patriarchal sense, like the breadwinners of the family.
Right. Those are like two of the reasons why he was seen as like this generous, loving king. He was also, though, reportedly like very cold, pious, sexless, and a bit of a warmonger, which in his day, that was the paragon of kingship. So that's why he was a good king.
Right.
He really didn't get up to any fun, was very serious, and went to war. So
yeah, so I guess it makes sense that the play that is like about this title character is a war play.
Mm-hmm. And then, and that he's then warmed up, I think, through the Elizabethan lens of what a good ruler is. Because a few generations later, it's changed a little bit, in the post-Renaissance time. For the medievals, yeah, that's what they wanted.
And that's the life of Henry V.
Yep.
Nice.
Those are some headlines, some major differences between historical Henry V and Shakespeare's.
Nice. So now let's go ahead and move on to some of the
family members, English nobility.
Yeah, the accomplices of Henry's campaign and political project, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about Thomas, Duke of Exeter, who is uncle to the king. So I'm going to pretty much just go through who this man was, because in the play he plays a trusted role. He's a soldier, and that pretty much lines up with the historical figure. So Exeter was a resolute and trusted soldier of Henry V. He was an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt and the half-brother of Henry IV. He was a military man, pretty much. He joined Richard II's retinue. He was an admiral. He was appointed chancellor in 1410 by Henry IV when Henry IV ascended in 1399. And this chancellor position was not well suited to him. He had a military temperament. And this office of the chancellor wasn't really a good fit. But most of his life, he served in a military capacity. He was appointed lieutenant in Aquitaine by Henry V, and he played a leading part in preparations for the war in France. He was a member of the embassy in 1415 at the start of the play, the start of the campaign, and he pledged the support of the lords. And in Harfleur, he delivered the town into his custody and defended it during Henry's march to Agincourt. And this brought him a lot of reward, both financially and in terms of title, which is something he did not have at the beginning of his life because he was an illegitimate son.
Which we see in the play. Henry instructs his uncle, Duke of Exeter, to stay in Harfleur and become the new governor. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a trusted commander and advisor, and he attended the king's crucial meeting with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, in 1416, which we don't get a John the Fearless in the play.
No.
But you'll hear John the Fearless being brought up throughout this historical recounting. Yeah. And he secured the northern frontier from the Scots during the second invasion of France in 1417. He was an active part in the second phase of the conquest in France in 1418, and in 1419, a town was placed in his custody. He did negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy. So most of his career was a military career.
And he does a lot of work in
military negotiations or
negotiations on behalf of Henry V. He's very, very close circle.
Yes. On Henry's return to England in 1421, so after the time frame of the play, Exeter was left military governor of Paris, which is, demonstrating that he was a trusted official in Henry's close circle. And then after Henry's death in 1422, that closed Exeter's military career. And Henry's confidence in Exeter led to his inclusion among the king's executors and fifis, and it led to his nomination in the codicil of the king's last will as governor of the person of his infant heir, Henry VI. So what this means is that he was added to the will, to Henry V's will, to be made the governor of Henry's infant heir, Henry VI. And then he did more military expeditions and had failing health and died in 1426. And the real takeaway from Exeter's life is that he furthered the interest and aims of the Lancastrian crown but he did not do it to his own family. So he was very invested in the Lancastrian crown, but not his own Beaufort.
Beaufort, yeah.
His own Beaufort family. So he was a diehard Henry V Lancastrian supporter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is his uncle.
Great.
Next, I'm going to go through his brothers. Henry had 3 brothers, and the first one is Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, referred to as Gloucester within the play, and he is the youngest son of Henry IV. He was protector of England during Henry VI minority. He was knighted in 1399 and made a Knight of the Garter in 1400 under his father's leadership, and Gloucester had no public employment, nor did he receive a title or endowment until Henry V had appointed him Chamberlain of England in 1413, and so he was appointed Duke of Gloucester and Earl of Pembroke for life, and that included a castle and a lordship. And Gloucester served with a large contingent on expedition to Harfleur in 1415, so he also participated in military expeditions. He fought in Agincourt, where he was wounded, and his life was saved by Henry V in person.
Yeah, I read about this in my sources. He was getting attacked, and Henry actually went in between them and stopped the axe from killing Gloucester.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then Gloucester returned to England, and he took on prominent roles in affairs of the state. He was appointed the Constable of Dover and Warden of the Cinque Ports, Chief Justice of the Forest south of Trent, received grants of the Barton in Bristol, the Isle of Wight, and the Lordship of Jonsteffen, and so he was well titled following his return to England. In 1416, at the conference of Henry V, Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, and John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, he became a hostage for Duke John's safety. I didn't read the details of this. This would be more of click to read more.
Okay.
But he also participated in the quest of Normandy in 1417 to 18. And in 1418, he was appointed lieutenant and captain general and led his first independent command, which took the surrender of a few towns. So it took 3 years for him to be appointed and lead his own independent command. And he remained in France until 1419. And then Gloucester held parliament in 1420, which ratified the Treaty of Troyes. And after Henry's death, Gloucester was then bestowed the tutela, or guardianship, of Henry VI, the infant heir. But then the governmental council, opposed this and appointed him the title of Protector and Defender of Henry VI, which...
It's the difference between being able to rule as King Regent and not being able to rule as King Regent.
Gloucester resented being denied the regency that he believes his brother had intended for him in the will, but then the council denied him. And following his brother's death, again, Henry died in 1422. Gloucester attempted to play politics in order to gain political leadership, and he didn't quite achieve that. He was generally distrusted in the political sphere, and there are a lot of different pieces to his post-Henry political life, but they're irrelevant to this play. So I'm just going to leave it at he was trying to work his way up politically, but he wasn't successful in a way he would have liked. The next brother is John, Duke of Bedford. He also is the son of Henry IV, and I just bring these up because they're not illegitimate sons.
Yeah, they're all legitimate sons.
He was a regent of France and a prince. Like his brothers, he was knighted in 1399 on the eve of his father's coronation and was knighted in 1402. He was appointed Master of the Mews and Falcons in 1402, and Henry V recognized his brother's abilities and gave him a greater role in warfare, politics, and diplomacy, and also increased his status and income. Bedford remained in England a lot as a lieutenant, but during the campaign in France, he commanded the fleet that won an important victory, ending the Franco-Genoese blockade of Harfleur. He also was with Henry when the Treaty of Troyes, or Final Peace, was signed in 1420. And in 1420, he also campaigned in France, and he joined Henry V during a siege, as well as during the formal entry into Paris. And then he was also present when the 3 treaties were ratified. This is not related to Henry, but he was also present at Oldcastle's execution. And Bedford became the heir to the throne after Clarence's death in 1421 and of France in 1422. He was the regent for Henry VI, and then he died in 1435. So Bedford, also his really big accomplishment was having a military career where he was close with his brother on military expeditions and being like in his close inner circle. And then the last brother is Thomas, Duke of Clarence. And Clarence was a prince and a soldier. He was knighted in 1399 and became a knight in 1400. Henry IV appointed Thomas to King's Lieutenant in Ireland in 1401 because there were fears that the Irish were going to revolt. But then he returned to England in 1403, and he also became an admiral of the fleet in 1405 to guard the Sea of Dover, and he did various services in Ireland as well until his father's death when he returned to England. And Henry and Thomas had differences while their dad was alive, and this is partially because Clarence was considered Henry IV's favorite son.
Mm-hmm.
So the two of them had tension while their father was alive.
Yeah.
But then by the time Henry V ruled, Clarence became Henry's partner in war, and Clarence oversaw the trial of Cambridge, Scroop, and Grey. And also he was at Harfleur, but he got dysentery and had to go back to England before the march to Agincourt. So wah wah for having such a partnership with his brother in war, and then he wasn't present for that big battle.
Big battle.
Yeah. And then he briefly acted as keeper of the realm when Henry V attended the tripartite conference. And in 1417, he landed at Toke with Henry V and embarked on a period of sustained campaigning, which ended with his death. So in 1421, a year before Henry V's death, Clarence was killed in hand-to-hand fighting, and his body was recovered from the field by the men of Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, who conducted the retreat. So those are Henry's brothers.
All right, now let's dive into a little bit about Henry's cousins. First up, we have the Duke of York. His full name is Edward of Langley, 2nd Duke of York. He is also depicted in Shakespeare's Richard II as the Duke of Almerol, although neither play mentions that the Duke of Almerol in Richard II or the Duke of York in Henry V are in fact the same historic individual.
That's interesting because as we could see with all the other, like the brothers and the uncle getting like different estates, different titles, you can go by another name if you advance in title.
Yep, exactly. It starts getting all kinds of interconnected, related from here on out. So bear with me. York is the grandson of King Edward III and therefore the cousin of Henry IV. He held significant positions during the reigns of Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V. He's also the nephew of Thomas of Woodstock. He was involved in the first round of negotiations for the marriage between Henry V and Catherine, which I'll talk more about when I talk about Catherine, but there's a couple rounds of negotiations for them to get married. He was present at the siege of Harfleur, and he was killed at Agincourt. According to some, he rushed forward to save King Henry V when King Henry V was assisting Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and preventing that axe from getting in Gloucester's face.
Yeah, the brother.
Yeah. He left no sons, so the heir to the Dukedom of York was his 4-year-old nephew, Richard Plantagenet, who would go on to start the Wars of the Roses. Another cousin is the Earl of Westmoreland, full name Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland. This is Henry's cousin by marriage. Westmoreland married King Henry IV's sister, Joan Beaufort. Westmoreland served in the military under King Richard II's uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, who knighted Neville in July 1380. He later supported Richard II in Richard's 1397 legal proceedings against Thomas of Woodstock, which is when he became the Earl of Westmoreland. He's also father-in-law to Sir Thomas Grey, who we see in the play, Henry Hotspur Percy from Henry IV, Part 1,
yeah.
and the Earl of Warwick. And he will be the grandfather of Edward IV and Richard III. We also have the Earl of Cambridge, full name Richard of Conisbrough, 3rd Earl of Cambridge. He is a younger brother to the Duke of York. He is beheaded for his role in the Southampton plot, which takes place at the beginning of the play Henry V, and he is the father of Richard Plantagenet. So those are the cousins. Next up, I'm going to get into English nobles, and you're going to hear more about the Southampton plot.
I'm excited for this little piece of history, yeah.
Because we'll see some of those characters who we only meet briefly at the beginning of the play. So, English nobles, we have the Earl of Warwick. That is Richard Beauchamp, 13th Earl of Warwick. He was knighted at the coronation of King Henry IV after the Battle of Shrewsbury, where he did some service. He was the Lord High Steward at the coronation of King Henry V, and he became a trusted counselor to Henry V, including helping put down a Lollard uprising. He was also Henry's representative at the Treaty of Troyes. The Earl of Salisbury, full name Richard Neville, 5th Earl of Salisbury, is a grandson of John of Gaunt, so he is a cousin of Henry V and nephew of Henry IV. He is the son of the Earl of Westmoreland, Ralph Neville, who I spoke of earlier.
And that's why they have the same name, Neville and Neville.
Yes, exactly. He served under King Henry IV, 5th, and 6th. And he is also brother-in-law to Richard Plantagenet, who's going to start the War of the Roses. Then we have the Earl of Huntingdon, full name John Holland. His father was originally the Duke of Exeter and was a half-brother of Richard II, but was executed for conspiring against Henry IV, and the Holland estates were forfeited. So the Earl of Huntingdon restored the estates by dedicating his life to royal service. He served at Agincourt and was made a Knight of the Garter for his service at Agincourt. Then we have Lord Scroop of Masham. That is Henry Scroop, 3rd Baron Scroop of Masham. He is a favorite of Henry V, but he became involved in the Southampton plot. Again, the Southampton plot is a plot to assassinate Henry V to prevent him from going to war in France. And some historians believe that the charges for the Southampton plot were inflated to punish specifically Lord Scroop for other acts of disloyalty.
That's really interesting because, hindsight, like Essex, who returned from Ireland, was in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth.
Yes. So the history echoes.
Yeah.
When this play is written, that hasn't
happened yet. But still, it's I guess it's a persistent threat to anybody who is a monarch who has favorites who
who might be doing something that people don't agree with. Yeah. Scroop also fought at Shrewsbury alongside Henry IV. So continuing in the Southampton plot, we also have Sir Thomas Grey, who is the 3rd conspirator of the Southampton plot in 1415. He's a descendant of King Edward I. His father and Sir Thomas Erpingham, who I'll talk in a moment about, were allies to Bolingbroke before he became King Henry IV, and were chosen to witness the abdication of King Richard II. Grey was a knight in service of Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, and served King Henry V when Henry was Prince of Wales. He also married Lady Alice Neville, who's the first daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland, so they're all interrelated.
Yeah.
He was beheaded at the North Gate of Southampton on the 2nd of August, 1415, and he said he participated in the Southampton plot due to, quote, poverty and covetousness, unquote. Our last noble is Sir Thomas Erpingham, who served under John of Gaunt and Edward III. It's unknown when he was knighted, but he was at least 21 when it happened. He is one of the 17 named companions who volunteered to accompany Henry Bolingbroke into exile. And then he was the chamberlain of the royal household under Henry IV once Henry Bolingbroke took the throne. And he was appointed guardian of Henry's son, Thomas, who is, again, Henry's favorite.
Yeah, that's Clarence, as a way to keep the names consistent.
Keep the names consistent, yeah. He was appointed the steward of the royal household by Henry V and presided over the surrender of Harfleur and commanded archers at Agincourt. First campaign in France, Sir Thomas Erpingham was one of the oldest men present at the age of 60.
Wow.
So those are the English nobles and Henry's cousins.
Yeah, and before we move on to some of these other positions, it seems like the nobles are from Henry IV generation, whereas the cousins and the brothers are Henry V's.
Yes, which my reading about Henry V was something that he did actually do and wasn't quite expected, was that when he became king, he kept some of the men who worked for his father as advisors and kind of cleaned some house, but also kept some trusted advisors who had been around for a while and who were much older than him.
Yeah, I guess that consistency in counselors. So now I want to go to the bishops, and I'm going to go through this quickly. If you're very interested in the bishops and their lives, there are a lot of details about their lives, but I'm going to keep these related to Henry. So the first one is the Bishop of Canterbury, and his name is Henry Chichel. And Chichel was the third Archbishop of Canterbury in succession to take an active role in the leadership of what was effectively an autonomous national church. His first principle was close coordination with royal policy, and he continued to be an active member of the council, which he headed during the king's absence on the French campaign of 1415. So he was not on the military expedition, but he was more a state religion kind of he was a statesman in addition to being the bishop. And that's really the role that he played. He played a leading part in the king's diplomacy, and he joined in Calais for discussions with the French delegation early in September 1416 and in Normandy from about December 1418 to August of 1419, and in the Paris region from sometime after June to November 1420. And he participated in discussions during the second voyage for surrender of Rouen and the marriage of Catherine of Valois. There is no indication that Chichel's opinions differed from Henry V's. He also participated in the attack of Lollardies. He prosecuted Lollards, and Henry had made heresy a felony in the Statute of Lollardy. So it was a big campaign that Henry V and his
shut down.
Yeah, shut down the Lollards. And Chichel, or Canterbury, was a big part of this. So that is Canterbury. And then there is the Bishop of Ely. His name is Thomas Arundel Fitzalan, and he was a bishop statesman like Canterbury. And he was an outspoken critic of Richard II's government, and he supported Bolingbroke. It is likely that he influenced Bolingbroke's declaration that he did not intend to take the crown, but to control the king by appointing officials and reforming the household, which would have been in Richard II. And during Richard II's reign, Ely lost his office, but then Henry IV reinstated him when he ascended to the throne, and he consulted on matters such as loans, which we hear Ely and Canterbury talk about at the beginning of the play. Mm-hmm. And he gave that dynasty, the Lancastrian dynasty, his full support, claiming the revolution enjoyed divine approval that was divinely ordained. And so he helped to enable Henry IV to claim the throne through, quote, "that right that God of his grace hath sent me," unquote. The support that the church could provide for an increasingly strong state was the basis for the achievements of Henry V, and Ely was a big advocate for strengthening this church state, this autonomous national church. Ely was said to be a volatile and emotional man, but he was also said to be a good mediator between the church and the state. Those are the two historical bishops, and I think that the first scene in Henry V, we don't know if they actually had that conversation, but based on this historical recounting of who these men were and their support for the Lancastrian line and also for strengthening the church, it seems like their representation in the play, or the purpose they served within the Lancastrian line, was pretty well represented in Shakespeare's play.
Now let's head over to France to talk very briefly about the cast of French characters.
Yes. I'm going to start with the King of France, Charles VI, the King of France. And during his reign, his nickname was the Beloved. And then in the 19th century, he was re-nicknamed the Mad. And I'll get into that. But he ascended to the throne at the age of 11, and his uncles were regents while he was a child king. So that'd be Philip II, Duke of Burgundy, Louis I, Duke of Anjou, John, Duke of Berry, and Louis II, Duke of Bourbon. And these are all names we'll come back to, but those are his uncles. Charles alternated between periods of what is described as mental instability and lucidity. We are not professionals, we're not going to diagnose it, but that is how he's historically remembered. And this affected his reign. There were times where the power of the French monarchy was held by his uncles as well as his wife. Queen, in the play, she's Queen Isabel, but she goes by Queen Isabella. Also, she's Bavarian, so Queen Isabeau. And then his younger brother, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, also aspired to the regency, and his younger brother also had a lot of influence in the French monarchy, French government. And the part of Charles VI's reign that is important for our purposes with Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt is that there was a civil war, the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War of 1407 to 1435, and it was during this period that the king found himself controlled by one of these two parties. Because of this, in 1415, Charles's army was crushed by the English at the Battle of Agincourt. The king, Charles VI, signed the Treaty of Troyes, which entirely disinherited his son, the Dauphin, who also is the future Charles VII, and it also was in favor of Henry V of England. And we don't really get a ton of the king in the play,
Yep.
and we'll get to some of a key point with the French political power in this next character. This is Queen Isabel of France. She's referred to as Isabella, and she's also referred to as Isabeau because she is Bavarian. And so I'm going to call her Queen Isabeau because that is her Bavarian name, Bavarian pronunciation.
Mhm.
And that's also what her Wikipedia page and Oxford Dictionary page say. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to go against Shakespeare's Queen Isabel.
Great.
But she was the Queen of France. She was the wife of King Charles VI and also the mother of the Dauphin in the play. And we will get into the identity of the Dauphin in a moment. I'm going to stick with Isabeau. When she was 15 or 16, she was sent to France to marry the young Charles VI. And the couple wed 3 days after their first meeting. And then she also had 12 children with him. So that's their marriage.
That's why we have to get into the identity of the Dauphin.
Yeah. Due to Charles VI's removal from government during those episodes of what are called mental illness, Isabeau sat on the Regency Council. And so Isabeau had to respond to political crises in France on behalf of Charles VI. But we're not going to talk about most of those because there are various periods and there's a lot of political turmoil in France at this time. We're going to focus on the ones that are related to Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt. As I mentioned, there was a civil war between the Armagnac and the Burgundian factions in France, and Henry took advantage of this civil war and in 1415 defeated France in the Battle of Agincourt. And during this time, Isabeau was imprisoned by Armagnac, one of the factions of the Civil War, but then she was released by Burgundy, the other faction. So partially during this time period in the play, she was imprisoned and released. And in 1420, Henry sent an emissary to confer with the queen, after which Isabeau, quote, ceded to what must have been a persuasively posed argument by Henry V's messenger, unquote. So whatever the messenger said sounded good to Isabeau. And so there was a treaty and the marriage of Henry V with her daughter, Catherine. At this time, there was an absence of an official heir to the throne. And so Isabeau accompanied King Charles to sign the Treaty of Troyes in May of 1420. But due to the king's illness, Isabeau went and stood in for the king. And in Shakespeare's play, the king is present, but historically,
and
the
so
king
is Isabeau.
Yes, yeah. But historically, the king wasn't present, and so it would have been just Isabeau or Isabel.
Yes.
Yeah. And under the terms of the treaty, Charles was still the king of France, but Henry V, married to her daughter Catherine, was to hold control over territories and then be the heir to Charles VI. And after Henry V and Charles VI died, Isabella was said to have lived in a degraded state and lived a promiscuous life. And these might just be rumors, we don't know. But she was removed from political life, even though she had a large resume of political work as the regent. But yeah, I think that this is a really interesting historical figure because there is that line that you mentioned in our Stuff to Chew On, Elyse, talking about women in the play. And when the negotiations are going on, Isabel points out that a woman should be here to make sure that the men don't just get all roiled up. So
yeah,
in some ways, that's kind of true to the fact that she was a regent in the council and also
was ruling
France. Yeah.
All right. Let's dive into their children who are present in the play, Catherine and the Dauphin. So Catherine, Princess of France. The first discussions of Henry marrying Catherine happened when Catherine was 7 and Henry was 22 and the Prince of Wales.
Ick.
Yeah, ick. The English and the French were trying to get these two together for a while, but these fell through due to King Henry IV's failing health and were resumed in 1414 when she would have been 14. There were other possible wives for Henry V, but eventually Catherine and Henry were married on the 2nd of June, 1420, when she was 18 and he was 33.
Still ick.
Still ick. She gave birth to Henry VI, the child who would become Henry VI, in 1421. Henry V would never meet his son, as he died in August 1422 leaving Catherine a queen dowager at the age of 20. Charles VI would die a couple months later, which left, due to the Treaty of Troy, left baby Henry VI king of both countries.
Mm-hmm. And that's why those uncles and brothers were executors, guardians, governors,
Yeah.
regents. Well,
regents. Yeah. One was a regent.
One was a regent.
Yeah. Catherine later has a sexual relationship with Owen Tudor. There is no known date of marriage for them, but also no evidence that a validity of marriage or legitimacy of their children was ever questioned, so it's assumed that they did marry. Their descendants, starting with their grandson, who would be King Henry VII, would make up the Tudor dynasty.
I think it's so fascinating that Shakespeare's play, from the previous stuff we had discussed, like the wooing did happen, but it's supposed to be so cute and charming in the play, but like he was 33 and she was 18, and it was this like arranged marriage or attempted arranged marriage. And so it seems like how much of that is an innovation?
Arranged marriage that had been like attempted over and over and over again, and then Shakespeare, it's still arranged, but it seems much more like, it seems like it's like this brand new
like
idea,
more spontaneous.
Like, and like but it was part of that like Treaty of Troy of like, and yes, like we'll finally make this happen, this thing that we've been talking about for a decade on and off,
right?
And then the Dauphin of France, which is the Crown Prince of France, during the majority of this play, and the like person that is presented and the one who like does the tennis balls bit is Louis, Duke of Guyenne, who was the third Dauphin. So Isabel and Charles VI had 12 children. They had 5 Dauphins, and Louis was the third. So his 2 older brothers passed away without heirs before him. He is about 10 years younger than Henry V. He was not present at Agincourt. He remained with his father at Rouen, but he did die a few months after Agincourt in December 1415, and eventually his younger brother, the 5th Dauphin, would become King Charles VII.
And so last, we are going to go through some French nobles. And I'm going to start with the French dukes. And those include the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Brittany, and the Duke of Bourbon. And the Duke of Berry is the same duke who was one of the king's royal uncles. So Charles VI's royal uncles. He is John, the Duke of Berry. And then there's also the Duke of Brittany, John V, the Duke of Brittany. And he was married to Charles VI and Isabeau's daughter, Joan. And then the last of these smaller dukes, or I guess less prominent dukes, is the Duke of Bourbon. And as I mentioned, Louis II, the Duke of Bourbon, was also one of the king's royal uncles, along with Duke of Berry. But by the events of Henry V, the Duke of Bourbon, Louis II, the Duke of Bourbon, has passed. And so his son becomes the Duke of Bourbon. Time has passed, and the Duke of Berry is the same uncle, and the Duke of Bourbon is not. Next up is the Duke of Burgundy. In the history that I've been talking about, I've mentioned John the Fearless, who was the Duke of Burgundy from about 1404 until 1419. But the Duke of Burgundy and Henry V is the Duke of Burgundy who participates in the Treaty of Troy with Henry V and Queen Isabeau. And the Treaty of Troy was signed in 1420. And so that means that this Duke of Burgundy is a different Duke of Burgundy from John the Fearless, who I'd mentioned, who was a leading figure in the Armagnac and Burgundian Civil War. John the Fearless is alive and participating in politics during the course of the Battle of Agincourt. He does not participate in the battle. He does not send troops to battle, and he dies before the Treaty of Troy. And so the Henry V, Duke of Burgundy, is his son, Philip III the Good. And the last Duke is Charles, Duke of Orleans. And Orleans was the nephew of Charles VI. So he was the king's nephew, closer in age to the Dauphin. In Shakespeare's play, Orleans provides counsel to the king. He is present at the Battle of Agincourt. And this is historically accurate. He was one of the many French noblemen at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and he was taken prisoner by the English and spent 24 years as their hostage. He was not offered release in exchange for ransom, and that is because Henry V had left instructions forbidding any release. In 1440, he was finally freed and lived until the age of 70. And so those are the French nobles.
And then we have the Constable of France. This is a position that was lieutenant to the King of France, the first of the original 5 great officers of the crown, and the commander-in-chief of the royal army. He was, at least on paper, the highest-ranking member of the French nobility. And during the time period that the play takes place, this would have been Charles II, Duke of Lorraine, also called the Bold. Charles, Constable of France, did not get involved in the Anglo-French War, but his brother died in the Battle of Agincourt. In 1425, he asserted that the job was too much for him and renounced it. And then there are the characters of Lord Grandpré, Lord Rambure, and Lord Beaumont, as well as the governor of Harfleur, which we were not able to find actual historical figures line up with those characters. So they are just soldiers, named soldiers, and noblemen for the French court in Shakespeare's play, as far as we were able to find in our research. But if you know more about them, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah.
And those are the historical figures of Shakespeare's Henry V. Like, there's a decent amount that lines up, and then there's, like, some interesting parts that are definitely elided, like the prosecution of proto-Protestants, and some things that are made, I guess, easier to digest for a Tudor audience. And I think where we go from here, what do you do with all this information?
Yeah.
Right? Something that we've talked about is it's interesting to know where Shakespeare invented or what had maybe shifted in, as you were talking about these other sources. And as I mentioned, like, there are multiple accounts and some come later, and are they gossip or are they actually what happened and what was more popular in Shakespeare's time? And, you know, if it's helpful when you are thinking about, you know, Clarence, is it helpful to know that he was Henry IV's
favorite
special
son?
boy?
Yeah.
How does that maybe like help inform a dynamic in between for the actors who are playing those parts? Or it's also okay to be like, it doesn't matter because Shakespeare didn't write it in.
Yeah, and especially because like looking at these historical figures, unless there are like big gaps that we missed, for Shakespeare's purposes, they are very primarily names and royal figures that took part in this period of history. But like Henry and the Eastcheap Company and, you know, all these other characters seem to have more like fleshed out character. And a lot of these people are like, you know, if you're watching a military movie or military film, the main character has a lot more character. And then the other people are like rank and file or like have positions, and their main purpose is like building that world. But it's not really about like, what was Clarence like as a person, you know?
Yes. So, you know, you can either take this or leave this, but it's very fascinating to think about the dynamics. For me, it was also fascinating to learn about how these aren't just like lords, like they are this person's son-in-law and this person's nephew, and that like helps inform like what are the stakes when these people are being, especially like the Southampton plot, for these to not just be some random nobles, but like they are cousins, nephews, uncles, all intertwined. I don't know, it increases the risk.
Yeah, the characters have more buy-in with the Lancastrian successes than just being random dukes and lords.
Yeah. Yeah, there's more to motivate them to do what they do.
Mm-hmm. And it's a history play, but in ways it's a lot more than just a history of these events, this Tudor myth.
Yes.
It's a play about how history is made, how is it remade, and it's a play about the reconstruction of history, how those who are telling history are intervening in the historical process. Take it or leave it, some of these details, but it's
the story that persists of King Henry V is very much intertwined with what Shakespeare made of him.
Yes.
The myth of King Henry V versus the historical fact. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, and ever thanks to our Patreon patron, Kelly. I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone.
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Hamlet, Quarto 2, Act 3, Scene 2, said by Player King. Faith, I must leave thee, love, and shortly too. My operant powers their functions leave to do, and thou shalt live in this fair world behind honored, beloved, and happily one as kind, for husband shalt thou.